Parmenides by Plato. When we arrived in Athens from home in Clazomenians, we ran into Adeimantus and Glaucon in the marketplace. Adeimantus took me by the hand and said, "Welcome, Cephalus. If there is anything you want here that we can do for you, please tell us." "In fact, that's the very reason I'm here," I replied, "to ask a favour of you." "Tell us what you want," he said. And I replied, "Your half-brother on your mother's side, what was his name? I've forgotten. He would have been a child when I came here from Clazomenians to stay before. That's a long time ago now. I think his father's name was Pyrilampes." "It was indeed," he said. "And his?" "Antiphon." "Why do you ask?" "These men are fellow citizens of mine," I said, "keen philosophers, and they have heard that this Antiphon met many times with a friend of Zeno's called PYTHODORUS, and can recite from memory the discussion that Socrates and Zeno and Parmenides once had, since he heard it often from Pythodorus." "That's true," he said. "Well, we want to hear that discussion," I replied. "Nothing hard about that," he said. "When Antiphon was a young man, he practiced it to perfection, although these days, just like the grandfather he's named for, he devotes most of his time to horses. But if that's what's called for, let's go to his house. He left here to go home just a short time ago, but he lives close by in Melite." After this exchange, we set off walking and found Antiphon at home, engaging a smith to work on a bit of some kind. When he had finished with the smith, and his brothers told him why we were there, he recognized me from my earlier visit and greeted me. We asked him to go through the discussion, and he balked at first. It was, he said, a lot of work, but finally he narrated it in detail. Antiphon said that Pythodorus said that Zeno and Parmenides once came to the great Panathenaea. Parmenides was already quite venerable, very grey but of distinguished appearance, about 65 years old. Zeno was at that time close to 40, a tall, handsome man who had been, as rumour had it, the object of Parmenides' affections when he was a boy. Antiphon said that the two of them were staying with Pythodorus outside the city wall in the potter's quarter, and that Socrates had come there along with a number of others, because they were eager to hear Zeno read his book, which he and Parmenides had just brought to Athens for the first time. Socrates was then quite young. Zeno was reading to them in person. Parmenides happened to be out. Very little remained to be read when Pythodorus, as he related it, came in, and with him Parmenides and Aristotle, the man who later became one of the 30. They listened to a little of the book at the very end, but not Pythodorus himself. He had heard Zeno read it before. Then Socrates, after he had heard it, asked Zeno to read the first hypothesis of the first argument again. And when he had read it, Socrates said, "Zeno, what do you mean by this? If things are many, they must be then both like and unlike. But that is impossible, because unlike things can't be like, or like things unlike. That's what you say, isn't it?" "It is," said Zeno. "If it's impossible for things to be like and like things unlike, isn't it then also impossible for them to be many? Because if there were many, they would have incompatible properties. Is this the point of your argument? Simply to maintain, in opposition to everything that is commonly said, that things are not many? And do you suppose that each of your arguments is proof for this position, so that you think you give as many proofs that things are not many as your book has arguments? Is that what you're saying? Or do I misunderstand?" "No," Zeno replied. "On the contrary, you grasp the general point of the book splendidly." "Parmenides," Socrates said, "I understand that Zeno wants to be on intimate terms with you, not only in friendship, but also in this book. He has, in a way, written the same thing as you, but by changing it round, he tries to fool us into thinking he is saying something different. You say in your poem that the all is one, and you give splendid and excellent proofs for that. He, for his part, says that it is not many, and gives a vast array of very grand proofs of his own. So with one of you saying one and the other not many, and with each of you speaking in a way that suggests that you've said nothing the same, although you mean practically the same thing, what you said you appear to have said over the heads of the rest of us." "Yes, Socrates," said Zeno. "Still, you haven't completely discerned the truth about my book, even though you chase down its arguments and follow their spoor as keenly as a young Spartan hound. First of all, you have missed this point. The book doesn't at all preen itself on having been written with the intent you described, while disguising it from people, as if it were some great accomplishment. You have mentioned something that happened accidentally. The truth is that the book comes to the defence of Parmenides' argument against those who try to make fun of it by claiming that if it is one, many absurdities and self-contradictions result from that argument. Accordingly, my book speaks against those who assert the many and pays them back in kind with something for good measure, since it aims to make clear that their hypothesis, if it is many, would, if someone examined the matter thoroughly, suffer consequences even more absurd than those suffered by the hypothesis of its being one. In that competitive spirit, then, I wrote the book when I was a young man. Someone made an unauthorized copy, so I didn't even have a chance to decide for myself whether or not it should see the light. So in this respect, you miss the point, Socrates. You think it was written not out of a young man's competitiveness, out of a mature man's vainglory. Still, as I said, your portrayal was not bad. I take your point, Socrates said, and I believe it was as you say. But tell me this, don't you acknowledge that there is a form, itself by itself, of likeness and another form opposite to this, which is what unlike is? Don't you and I and the other things we call many get a share of those two entities, and don't things that get a share of likeness come to be like in that way and to the extent that they get a share, whereas things that get a share of unlikeness come to be unlike, and things that get a share of both come to be both? And even if all things get a share of both, though they are opposites, by partaking of them are both like and unlike themselves, what's astonishing about that? If someone showed that the likes themselves come to be unlike, or the unlikes like, that I think would be a marvel. But if he shows that things that partake of both of these have both properties, there seems to be nothing strange about that, Zeno. Not even if someone shows that all things are one by partaking of oneness, and that these same things are many by partaking also of multitude. But if he should demonstrate this thing itself, what one is, to be many, or conversely, the many to be one, at this I'll be astonished. And it's the same with all the others. If he could show that the kinds and forms themselves have in themselves these opposite properties, that would call for astonishment. But if someone should demonstrate that I am one thing and many, what's astonishing about that? He will say when he wants to show that I'm many, that my right side is different from my left and my front from my back, and likewise with my upper and lower parts. Since I can take it, I do partake of multitude. But when he wants to show that I'm one, will he say I'm one person among the seven of us, because I also partake of oneness? Thus he shows that both are true. So if, in the case of stones and sticks and such things, someone tries to show that the same thing is many and one, we'll say that he is demonstrating something to be many and one, not the one to be many or the many one. And we'll say that he is saying nothing astonishing, but just what all of us would agree to. But if someone first distinguishes as separate the forms, themselves by themselves, of the things I was talking about a moment ago, for example, likeness and unlikeness, multitude and oneness, rest and motion, and everything of that sort, and then shows that in themselves they can mix together and separate, I, for my part, he said, would be utterly amazed, Zeno. I think these issues have been handled with great vigour in your book, but I would, as I say, be much more impressed if someone were able to display this same difficulty which you and Parmenides went through in the case of visible things, also similarly entwined in multifarious ways in the forms themselves, in things that are grasped by reasoning. Pythodorus said that while Socrates was saying all this, he himself kept from moment to moment expecting Parmenides and Zeno to get annoyed. But they both paid close attention to Socrates and often glanced at each other and smiled, as though they admired him. In fact, what Parmenides said when Socrates had finished confirmed this impression. Socrates, he said, you are much to be admired for your keenness for argument. Tell me, have you yourself distinguished as separate, in the way you mentioned, certain forms themselves, and also as separate the things that partake of them? And do you think that likeness itself is something, separate from the likeness we have, and one and many, and all the things you heard Zeno read about a while ago? I do indeed, Socrates answered. And what about these? Asked Parmenides. Is there a form, itself by itself, of just and beautiful and good and everything of that sort? Yes, he said. What about a form of a human being separate from us and all those like us? Is there a form itself of a human being, or fire, or water? Socrates said. Parmenides, I've often found myself in doubt whether I should talk about those in the same way as the others or differently. And what about these, Socrates? Things that might seem absurd, like hair and mud and dirt, or anything else totally undignified and worthless. Are you doubtful whether or not you should say that a form is separate for each of these too, which in turn is other than anything we touch with our hands? Not at all, Socrates answered. On the contrary, these things are in fact just what we see. Surely, it's too outlandish to think there is a form for them. Not that the thought that the same thing might hold in all cases has troubled me from time to time. Then, when I get bogged down in that, I hurry away, afraid that I may fall into some pit of nonsense and come to harm. But when I arrive back in the vicinity of the things we agreed a moment ago have forms, I linger there and occupy myself with them. That's because you are still young, Socrates, said Parmenides, and philosophy has not yet gripped you as, in my opinion, it will in the future, once you begin to consider none of the cases beneath your notice. Now, though you still care about what people think because of your youth. But tell me this, is it your view that, as you say, there are certain forms from which these other things, by getting a share of them, derive their names, as for instance they come to be like by getting a share of likeness, large by getting a share of largeness, and just by beautiful by getting a share of justice and beauty? It certainly is, Socrates replied. So, does each thing that gets a share get as its share the form as a whole, or a part of it? Or could there be some other means of getting a share apart from these two? How could there be? He said. Do you think, then, that the form as a whole, one thing, is in each of the many? Or what do you think? What's to prevent its being one? Parmenides, said Socrates. So, being one and the same, it will be at the same time, as a whole, in things that are many and separate, and thus it will be separate from itself? No, it won't, Socrates said. Not if it's like one and the same day, that is in many places at the same time, and is nonetheless not separate from itself. If it's like that, each of the forms might be at the same time one and the same in all. Socrates, he said, how neatly you make one and the same thing in many places at the same time. It's as if you were to cover many people with a sail, and then say one thing as a whole is over many. Or isn't that the sort of thing you mean to say? Perhaps, he replied. In that case, would the sail be as a whole over each person, or would a part of it be over one person and another part over another? A part? So the forms themselves are divisible, Socrates, he said, and things that partake of them would partake of a part, no longer would a whole form, but only a part of it, be in each thing? It does appear that way. Then you are willing to say, Socrates, that our one form is really divided. Will it still be one? Not at all, he replied. No, said Parmenides, for suppose you are going to divide largeness itself. If each of the many large things is to be large by a part of largeness, smaller than largeness itself, won't that appear unreasonable? It certainly will, he replied. What about this? Will each thing that has received a small part of the equal have something by which to be equal to anything when its portion is less than the equal itself? That's impossible. Well, suppose one of us is going to have a part of the small. The small will be larger than that part of it. Since the part is a part of it, so the small itself will be larger. And that to which the part subtracted is added will be smaller, not larger than it was before. That surely couldn't happen, he said. Socrates, in what way then will the other things get a share of your forms, if they can do so neither by getting parts nor by getting wholes? By Zeus, Socrates exclaimed, it strikes me that's not at all easy to determine. And what do you think about the following? What's that? I suppose you think each form is one on the following ground. Whenever some number of things seem to you to be large, perhaps there seems to be some one character, the same as you look at them all, and from that you conclude that the large is one. That's true, he said. What about the large itself and the other large things? If you look at them all in the same way with the mind's eye, again won't some one thing appear large, by which all these appear large? It seems so. So another form of largeness will make its appearance, which has emerged alongside largeness itself and the things that partake of it, and in turn another over all these, by which all them will be large. Each of your forms will no longer be one, but unlimited in multitude. But, Parmenides, maybe each of these forms is a thought, Socrates said, and properly occurs only in minds. In this way, each of them might be one and no longer face the difficulties mentioned just now. What do you mean, he said. Is each of the thoughts one, but a thought of nothing? No, that's impossible, he said. Of something, rather. Yes. Of something that is, or of something that is not? Of something that is. Isn't it of some one thing which that thought thinks is over all the instances, being some one character? Yes. Then won't this thing that is thought to be one, being always the same over all the instances, be a form? That too appears necessary. And what about this, said Parmenides? Given your claim that other things partake of forms, won't you necessarily think that either that each thing is composed of thoughts and all things think, or that although they are thoughts, they are unthinking? That isn't reasonable either, Parmenides, he said. No, what appears most likely to me is this. These forms are like patterns set in nature, and other things resemble them, and are likenesses, and this partaking of the form is, for the other things, simply being modelled on them. If something resembles the form, he said, can that form not be like what has been modelled on it, to the extent that the thing has been made like it? Or is there any way for something like to be like, but is not like it? There is not. And isn't there a compelling necessity for that which is like to partake of the same one form as what is like it? There is. But if like things are like by partaking of something, won't that be the form itself? Undoubtedly. Therefore nothing can be like the form, nor can the form be like anything else. Otherwise, alongside the form, another form will always make its appearance. And if that form is like anything, yet another, and if the form proves to be like what partakes of it, a fresh form will never cease emerging. That's very true. So other things don't get a share of the forms by likeness. We must seek some other means by which they get a share. So it seems. And do you see, Socrates, he said, how great the difficulty is if one marks things off as forms themselves by themselves? Quite clearly. I assure you, he said, that you do not yet, if I may put it so, have an inkling of how great the difficulty is if you are going to posit one form in each case every time you make a distinction among things. How so, he asked. There are many other reasons, Parmenides said, but the main one is this. Suppose someone were to say that if the forms are such as we claim they must be, they cannot even be known. If anyone should raise that objection, you wouldn't be able to show him that he is wrong, unless the objector happened to be widely experienced and not ungifted, and consented to pay attention while your effort to show him you dealt with many distant considerations. Otherwise, the person who insists that they are necessarily unknowable would remain unconvinced. Why is that, Parmenides? Socrates asked. Because I think that you, Socrates, and anyone else who posits that there is for each thing some being, itself by itself, would agree, to begin with, that none of those things is in us. Yes, how could it still be itself by itself? Replied Socrates. Very good, said Parmenides. And so all the characters that are what they are in relation to each other have their being in relation to themselves, but not in relation to things that belong to us. And whether one posits the latter as likenesses or in some other way, it is by partaking of them that we come to be called by their various names. These things that belong to us, although they have the same names as the forms, are in their turn, they are in relation to themselves, but not in relation to the forms. And all the things named in this way are of themselves, but not of the forms. What do you mean? Socrates asked. Take an example, said Parmenides. If one of us is somebody's master or somebody's slave, he is surely not a slave of master itself, of what a master is, nor is the master a master of slave itself, of what a slave is. On the contrary, being a human being, he is a master or slave of a human being. Mastery itself, on the other hand, is what it is of slavery itself. And, in the same way, slavery itself is slavery of mastery itself. things in us do not have their power in relation to forms, nor do they have theirs in relation to us. But, I repeat, forms are what they are of themselves and in relation to themselves. And things that belong to us are, in the same way, what they are in relation to themselves. Do you understand what I mean? Certainly, Socrates said, I understand. So too, he said, knowledge itself, what knowledge is, would be knowledge of that truth itself, which is what truth is. Certainly. Furthermore, each particular knowledge, what it is, would be knowledge of some particular thing, of what that thing is. Isn't that so? Yes. But wouldn't knowledge that belongs to us be of the truth that belongs to our world? And wouldn't it follow that each particular knowledge that belongs to us is in turn knowledge of some particular thing in our world? Necessarily. But as you agree, we neither have the forms themselves nor can they belong to us. Yes, you're quite right. And surely the kinds themselves, what each of them is, are known by the form of knowledge itself. Yes, the very thing that we don't have. No, we don't. So none of the forms is known by us, because we don't partake of knowledge itself. It seems not. And the beautiful itself, what it is, cannot be known by us, nor can the good, nor indeed can any of the things we take to be characters themselves. It looks that way. Here's something even more shocking than that. What's that? Surely you would say that if in fact there is knowledge, a kind itself, it is much more precise than is knowledge that belongs to us, and the same goes for beauty and all the others. Yes. Well, whatever else partakes of knowledge itself, wouldn't you say that God, more than anyone else, has this most precise knowledge? Necessarily. Tell me, will God, having knowledge itself, then be able to know things that belong to our world? Yes, why not? Because we have agreed, Socrates, Parmenides said, that those forms do not have their power in relation to things in our world, and things in our world do not have theirs in relation to forms, but that things in each group have their power in relation to themselves. Yes, we did agree on that. Well then, if this most precise mastery and this most precise knowledge belongs to the divine, God's mastery could never master us, nor could their knowledge know us or anything that belongs to us. No, just as we do not govern them by their governance, and know nothing of the divine by our knowledge, so they in turn are, for the same reason, neither our masters, nor, being gods, do they know human affairs. If God is to be stripped of knowing, he said, our argument may be getting too bizarre. And yet, Socrates, said Parmenides, the forms inevitably involve these objections and a host of others besides. If there are those characters for things, and the person is to mark off each form as something itself, as a result, whoever hears about them is doubtful and objects that they do not exist, and that even if they do, they must by strict necessity be unknowable to human nature. And in saying this, he seems to have a point, and as we said, he is extraordinarily hard to win over. Only a very gifted man can come to know that for each thing there is some kind, a being itself by itself, but only a prodigy more remarkable still will discover that and be able to teach someone else who has sifted all these difficulties thoroughly and critically for himself. I agree with you, Parmenides, Socrates said. That's very much what I think too. Yet, on the other hand, Socrates, said Parmenides, if someone, having an eye on all the difficulties we have just brought up, and others of the same sort, won't allow that there are forms for things, and won't mark off a form for each one, he won't have anywhere to turn his thought, since he doesn't allow that for each thing there is a character that is always the same. In this way he will destroy the power of dialectic entirely. But I think you are only too well aware of that. What you say is true, Socrates said. What then will you do about philosophy? Where will you turn while these difficulties remain unresolved? I don't think I have anything clearly in view, at least not at present. Socrates, that's because you are trying to mark off something beautiful and just and good, and each one of the forms, too soon, before you have been properly trained. I noticed that the other day, too, as I listened to you conversing with Aristotle here. The impulse you bring to argument is noble and divine. Make no mistake about it. But while you are still young, put your back into it and get more training through something people think useless, what the crowd will call idle talk, otherwise the truth will escape you. What manner of training is that, Parmenides? He asked. The manner is just what you heard from Zeno, he said, except I was also impressed by something you had to say to him. You didn't allow him to remain among visible things and observe their wandering between opposites. You asked him to observe it instead among those things that one might above all grasp by means of reason and might think to be forms. I did that, he said, because I think that here among the visible things it's not at all hard to show that things are both like and unlike, and anything else you please. And you are quite right, he said, but you must do the following in addition to that. If you want to be trained more thoroughly, you must not only hypothesize if each thing is and examine the consequences of that hypothesis, you must also hypothesize if that same thing is not. What do you mean? He asked. If you like, said Parmenides, take as an example this hypothesis that Zeno entertained, if many are. What must the consequences be both for the many themselves in relation to themselves and in relation to the one, and for the one in relation to itself and in relation to the many? And, in turn, on the hypothesis, if many are not, you must again examine what the consequences will be both for the one and for the many in relation to themselves and in relation to each other. And again, in turn, if you hypothesize if likeness is or if it is not, you must examine what the consequences will be on each hypothesis, both for the things hypothesized themselves and for the others, both in relation to themselves and in relation to each other. And the same method applies to unlike, to motion, to rest, to generation and destruction, and to being itself and not being, and, in a word, concerning whatever you might ever hypothesize as being or as not being, or as having any other property. You must examine the consequences for the thing you hypothesize in relation to itself and in relation to each one of the others, whichever you select, and in relation to several of them and to all of them in the same way. And in turn, you must examine the others, both in relation to themselves and in relation to whatever other thing you select on each occasion, whether what you hypothesize as being or as not being. All this you must do if, after completing your training, you are to achieve a full view of the truth.